Okay, everyone. This part of the course, we're looking at some of the key boundary rituals, boundary markers that are rituals which serve as boundary markers between Jews and the rest of the world, Jews and Christians, etc. So we looked at last week at circumcision. The only thing I didn't have a chance to get to is the very last line of my notes last week about circumcision, that Christians replace circumcision. Christians, of course, remove circumcision as a physical, corporeal marker. It becomes a spiritual marker, right? What God really wants is spiritual circumcision, not circumcision in the flesh. But Christians do propound a new boundary marker, a new ritual boundary marker of their own. I don't have time to deal with that in any detail, but it's one line at the end of the notes, just it's an important line, that circumcision is replaced by baptism. Right, so Christianity propounds a new ritual to replace circumcision as a boundary marker. So you are in the church if you are baptized, you're not if you're not. Many Christians disagree with what I just said. That's fine. This is a long, complicated history. The history of baptism is also a long and rich one. That'll take us too far afield for this course. I simply want to say the replacement of circumcision the removal of circumcision as a marker by Christians is not the product of a philosophical, ideological, deep-seated abhorrence of ritual. That will come later in Christianity. You have radical Protestants who will denounce any kind of ritual. That's much, much later. That's in the 16th century, 17th century. Okay, here it's not an abhorrence of ritual, it's an abhorrence of this ritual. Okay, so circumcision gets replaced by baptism. Okay, that's last week. Done. This week, we're looking at the food laws. Next week, we're looking at the Sabbath. And these are, in many respects, are the big three among ritual markers between Jews and Christians: circumcision, food laws, and Sabbath. Food laws. So we begin discussion of food laws, of course, with the material from the Hebrew Bible, from mostly the chapter 11 of Leviticus. And then from there we'll get to Judaism and Christianity. So, all cultures have food taboos. I begin with the obvious, right? There is not a single human culture anywhere on the planet, living or dead, that does not have some kind of food taboos. Either foods that we like to eat, or usually the way food taboos are manifest, things that we will never eat, things that we don't eat, right? So Americans also have food taboos, right? No one eats horse meat. No one eats dog. Even though there are cultures of the world where people eat horses and dogs, and for all I know, they taste very good. I have no idea, right? But I would not be surprised to learn that they taste good, right? But we in America don't eat those things, right? These are sort of implicit taboos in our culture. There's no law, but it is a cultural norm. We don't eat these things. In ancient cultures and societies, often you have laws, right, or texts which spell out specifically what we eat, and more pointedly, what we don't eat. So the system of the Jewish food taboos, or from the Bible to Judaism, is called kashrut, right? Or the word kasher, which means fit. Okay, in modern Jewish American, it's usually called kosher. That's how it's usually pronounced, with the accent on the first syllable. But in biblical Hebrew, the word would be kasher, although the Bible never uses this word with connection with food. So it's a rabbinic use of the word kasher, kosher, if you like, to refer to food that is fit to eat. The word kosher means fit. Okay, we begin with Leviticus 11, the big chapter, which I ask you to look at. And Leviticus 11 is an extraordinarily complicated and messy chapter, no less fascinating because of that. And Leviticus 11 immediately brings us into the very complicated world of holiness and impurity. So I need to talk a little bit about that, to understand what's going on in Leviticus, and this will be the language that will later on be used by both Jews and to some extent Christians when talking about these things. So what do we mean by holiness, and what do we mean by purity? So first we need to understand we have two parallel contrasts. There is something which is called holiness, noun, holy, adjective, which in turn is oppositional versus something which is not holy. So holiness is a status. Holiness is a marked out terrain by the biblical authors, by the biblical texts. And then you have something which is simply not holy. The other parallel pair to keep track of here is a contrast between impure and pure, sometimes translated unclean and clean. Where here again, the status of impure is a status, it's a thing. It is defined, it is definable. And something which is not impure is simply not impure. Or the way I like to talk about it, holiness is a numinous state. Holiness is electric. Holiness is charged. Holiness will zap you if you're not careful. I'll go back to that in 1 second. Similarly, impurity is electric. Impurity is numinous. Impurity is charged. And the whole point of the purity and holiness system is to keep impurity away from holiness. If you like to use my electricity metaphor, one's the positive and one's the negative. Actually, they repel if they're both the same, aren't they? Well, okay, my electricity metaphor doesn't work too well. Okay, but you got the idea, right? These are opposite charges, right? And they repel each other. So something which is impure needs to be kept away from something which is holy. Something which is holy needs to be protected from trespass from the realm of the impure. Okay? So let's go look at these things separately, and then we'll put them back together, and then we'll get to the food laws. Any questions on this? Okay, if you take Religion 101, you will talk about this. If you take Religion 101, you will talk about sacrifices, the sacrificial cult, and you will talk about impurity and purity. Because every culture on the face of the planet has notions of purity and impurity. And the question you do in Religion 101 is to figure out what does it mean. Okay, back to where we are. So let's begin with holiness. God is the source of holiness. God is holy. That's an important point. So the realm of the holy, the Hebrew word is kadosh, the sacred or the holy. This is the realm of the divine. But not just God is holy, things on earth that partake of the divine or stand in some particularly close relationship with divine, they too can be said to be holy or to become holy. So here I've given you on the handout the key terms or key concepts. Places can be holy, namely the tabernacle. What the hell is the tabernacle? I know there's a Mormon Tabernacle Choir. I know everybody knows that in Salt Lake City. Yes, I've actually been there, visited the Mormon Tabernacle. Yes, okay, very nice. But that, of course, it takes its name and concept from something else. So what is a tabernacle? A tabernacle is the portable tent shrine erected by the Israelites when they were wandering in the desert. They have left Egypt. They've gone through the Exodus, gone through the splitting of the Red Sea. They received the Ten Commandments at Mount Sinai, or Horeb in the book of Deuteronomy. Right? And according to the book of Exodus, they build a rather elaborate portable tent shrine. It's portable. They pack it up, move, unpack, set it up. They go to the next place, they pack it up, and the descriptions are laid out very clearly in the book of Numbers, right? How it's packed up and then set up again. That's the tabernacle, which is somehow a mysterious kind of forerunner for the temple. By the temple, I mean, of course, the sacred center, the building erected in Jerusalem. So the tabernacle is portable, temple stays put. Tabernacle was built in the wilderness by the Israelites. The temple was built in Jerusalem when the Judeans have conquered the land and set up a kingdom. At least that's the story in the book of Kings. Okay, key point. Tabernacle is holy. Its appurtenances are holy. All the stuff inside is holy, right? The boards, the beams, the leather, the wood. I mean, it's all holy. Everything's holy. Similarly, the temple is holy. And ultimately, the land of Israel itself partakes of some kind of holiness in a number of these texts. Why? Presumably there's some special connection between God, the source of holiness, and these places and these objects. So, places, objects, I already mentioned that. Temple offerings, times can be holy. Sabbath is a holy day. Right? Genesis chapter 2. Right? The very beginning of Genesis, right? That God sanctified the Sabbath day. God made the Sabbath day holy. What does that mean, you ask me? I'm not quite sure, but I know that it means the Sabbath has some special status. And that we'll talk about next week. So the Sabbath is holy. Festivals are holy. The people of Israel are holy, namely the priests are especially holy. We Cohens, right, we of course serve in the temple, right? We are the sacred caste, C-A-S-T-E, that serves in the temple. Consequently, we enter into sacred precincts, lay Israelites, plebs, proletariat, right? They, of course, are outside, behind the velvet rope. Only we Cohens get to go inside. So therefore, we Cohens are also holy. Ah, for the good old days. Okay, people holy. Okay, so that's holy. So holy is God and the divine, and holy are things, places, objects, times that have some particular intimate relationship with the divine. And what this all means, you ask me, I'm not quite sure. I'm just telling you what the texts say. Okay, then comes the key concept, which I already mentioned, and here I give you on the handout the quote from Leviticus 15. The holy, the domain of the divine, is to be protected from impurity. That's where we got a problem. If impurity invades the realm of the holy. If that happens, we have a problem. If that happens, you run the risk of inciting the divine to anger. So you shall put the Israelites on guard against their uncleanness or impurity, lest they die through their impurity by the defiling of my tabernacle which is among them. This already raises now the problem of impurity and sin. I'll hold on to that. I'll come back to the connection between impurity and sin in a moment. The sin to be careful of is you, Israelite, lay and priest alike. You need to be careful that you do not do anything so as to bring impure into the realm of the holy. Because if you do, unpleasant consequences will follow. As this verse says, you will die. Okay, last point. Leviticus 11, the food laws, the chapter of the food laws, ends with this wonderful line, you shall be holy, for I am holy. This is God speaking. This is one of the leitmotifs of various strands within the book of Leviticus, right? That the Israelites, too, are to aspire to be holy. Right? There's a status to which they aspire, to be holy just like God. Now, why this is a fitting end, you ask, for the chapter about food laws, again, is not completely clear. There is some clear connection that the animals that we eat somehow are pure. They're not impure. And the animals that we don't eat are somehow the impure ones. And consequently, as in our quest for holiness, we avoid the impure. So that's how we Israelites are holy, because I, the Lord, your God, am holy. However, just a small note, holiness in numerous world cultures, what is a saint? Saint, sanctus, holy, right? There's a Latin. Saint is the Latin word for sanctus. English, saint, Latin, sanctus equals holy, right? A saint is someone who, invariably in all world religions and cultures, holiness is always sanctity is always associated with some kind of renunciation. Everyone else is busy doing something, but the saint doesn't do it. Maybe it's food, maybe it's sex, maybe it's clothing, maybe it's some combination of those, or all of those, or a bunch of other things, or maybe it's wealth, whatever. Honor, prestige, whatever. Saint is someone who withdraws from society or from normal trappings of human civilization. So maybe it's chapter 11 of Leviticus 2 is suggesting that too. The holiness of the Israelites is precisely because they don't eat certain animals. It's a kind of renunciation. Maybe that's what's implied, I'm not sure. Okay, so that's the holiness part. So holiness, in shorthand, holiness is the realm of the divine. Now, most things in life, of course, are not holy. They're not impure, they're not pure, they're not holy, they're just there. It's holiness which is the status. I said holiness is electric. Holiness is charged. And then things that aren't holy, they're not holy. Okay, now let's look at purity. Questions on this? I said again, you take Anthro 101 or Religion 101 to discuss all these things in a comparative perspective, and there's been an enormous amount of scholarly attention trying to understand what these things mean. Because to us modern people, these notions are completely foreign and bizarre. Okay, next, let's talk about the fun part. Impurity, which obviously is much more fun than holiness. So, impurity. Impurity, like holiness, is the electric charged numinous state. Right? Sparks are flying around things that are impure. And so 99th time, you got to keep the impurity away from the holiness. So what is impure? Here I'm going to say something which Thompson says in your article more than once, and I'm going to repeat it several times today, and you won't believe me, and you're not going to be convinced. But I'll say it anyway. Impurity has nothing to do, footnote, I'll come back to one exception in a second. Footnote, back to where I am. Footnote. Address. Impurity has nothing to do with sin. Impurity is not a moral state. Impurity is not a sign of the rejection of God. Impurity is not a rebellion against God. Impurity does not mean you're bad. Impurity means you're impure, as defined by the priestly legislators of the book of Leviticus and Numbers. And, key point, as long as you, impure person, stay away from the holy, as long as you, Israelite, keep impure things out of the realm of the holy, then you have committed no sin. You incur no danger. The problem will come if you, impure Israelite, if you trespass into the realm of the sacred, or you introduce into the sacred realm something which doesn't belong there because it is impure. If that happens, there'll be an explosion. So it's not a moral state, at least not in the book of Leviticus. I'll come back to an exception in 1 second. So what is impure according to Leviticus? Leviticus 11 is part of a whole series of chapters about impurity, where we hear about Leviticus 11, impure animals. Leviticus 12, a woman in childbirth is impure. Leviticus 13 and 14, usually translated leprosy, some kind of skin disease. We would call it skin disease. What the text calls it is leprosy. No one's 100% sure what that means. Leprosy in persons, clothing, or buildings can have leprosy. Leviticus 15, sexual discharges, both male and female, both regular and irregular. And then Numbers 19, a human corpse. All of these things are impure. So, just to make the point clear, is it a sin, class, for a woman to menstruate? No. Is it a sin for a woman to give birth? Of course not. One assumes that Israelite fathers and husbands wanted their wives to give birth. One assumes, given values of traditional culture, right? That's what they would want. Is it a sin for a man to ejaculate? Not usually, but that's more complicated. But the short answer is no. Is skin disease in and of itself sinful? No. So all these states are states of impurity, even though we all understand, we all agree, that sinfulness does not seem to be an appropriate category. Okay, do you understand this? Is this very clear to you? Will you now be able to distinguish between impurity from immorality, impurity from sin, impurity from evil? Is it clear to you why these people in these states are impure? No, not clear to me in the slightest. Why is blood flowing from a wound not impure, whereas blood flowing from a woman's genitalia is? I mean, I can make up something, but the texts don't say it, and it's not obvious why this should be so. And of all bodily secretions, why just this? Right? Nasal mucus does not cause impurity. Urine and feces don't cause impurity, even though urine and feces are, quote, dirty. But they don't cause impurity. So explain that. Yeah, exactly. I'm not quite sure how to explain it, nor is anybody else. This has been the subject, a set of intense speculation as people try to understand what's going on here. What is it? Is this a fear of sex? Is it a male fear of women? Is it the fear of blood? Yeah, all these things sort of factor in to some degree. But at the end of the day, none of them really work. The one that works the best is death. That all of these impurities somehow partake of death. So that which is close to death, human corpse being my prime example, right? Death is the opposite of holiness. So death is impurity, right? Then you ask, well, then why is a woman in childbirth impure? Well, I don't know exactly, but these are profound psychological things. Sex, death goes together, and everybody who reads Woody Allen movies knows this is true, right? And Freud too. Sex, death, and from men's perspective, women too. It's all part of it's all connected. As I said, take Religion 101. You'll discuss these things. Okay. So now let's understand how the system works. So, a woman in childbirth, she is impure. Length of her impurity depends upon whether she has a male or a female child. Another incomprehensible and mysterious law in Leviticus 12. Okay, as long as she stays out of the realm of the holy, the temple precincts, during the state of her impurity, she has committed no sin. She's perfectly fine. In fact, we assume her village will rejoice that she's had a baby. However, once her impurity lapses, which is described in the text, at that point she may then undergo, like other impure people, undergo some kind of purification ritual. The ritual might be a simple ritual, like wash, bathe, wait till nightfall, or it might be a complicated purification ritual, like the ritual described in Numbers 19 for a person who's contacted a corpse. So in Israelite society, burial of a corpse is a virtue. Israelites do not cremate their dead. Israelites bury their dead. So burial of the dead, one assumes, was looked upon as a civic virtue. Certainly a child is supposed to bury one's dead parents. This is how one shows honor to one's parents in terms of that society. But that act is an act that causes a great deal of impurity, high level impurity, which requires then a high level of purification, fancy schmancy ritual, which is described in Numbers 19. It lasts 7 days. It needs to be sprinkled, blah, 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 washing, blah, 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 wait till nightfall. It's a complicated ritual. So some impurity is relatively minor, with a quick and easy purification. Some impurities are relatively major, requiring long, protracted series of purification, lasting up to a week. So, something which is pure one day can become impure, and then, key point, can then have its impurity removed by following the prescribed ritual of purification. Okay? That's what you need to know. Footnote. You see the small print there? In contrast, elsewhere impurity can be a result of moral failure. Here's that footnote. Usually in the text, what I've been talking about now, from Leviticus 11, Leviticus 12, Leviticus 13 and 14 about leprosy, Leviticus 15 about sexual discharges, number 19 about contact with a corpse, Right? In these 5 chapters, which is what we're talking about, because we're interested in Leviticus 11, about the food, which we'll return shortly. In these chapters, impurity has nothing to do with moral failure. Nothing to do with rebellion against God. It's a physical state. Either you are or you aren't. Either you contacted a corpse or you didn't contact a corpse. Either you have a sexual discharge or you didn't. I'm not interested in stories. Just give me the facts. Did you or did you not? If you did, consequences follow. If you didn't, fine. Then you remain as you were. It's Leviticus 18, not one of those chapters, and Leviticus 20, a parallel to it, a very close parallel, where the language of impurity is used in a sense of moral failure. And that's the killer. That's what gets everybody confused. Here we have a different kind of rhetoric, which I'm not talking about. Leviticus 18, where if you do commit a sin against God, here particularly a list of sexual sins is spelled out, seems to be highlighted. Leviticus 18, and it's parallel Leviticus 20. If you do that, then you will bring impurity upon the holy land. The land is supposed to be pure, but you, because of your fornications, because of your idolatries, because of your adulteries, you have impurified the land. And God, as a result, is going to blow up at you and throw you out. Because you've proven to be bad tenants. That's Leviticus 18, where now we discover that the language of impurity is used to refer to precisely moral acts, specifically sexual transgressions. So Leviticus 18 and 20 seem to have the rhetoric of impurity, but they mean something else by it. Okay? I'm not talking about that. I'm mentioning that here just to confuse you, A, and B, because I'm obligated to. It's part of my job. I have to give you all the stuff. What can I do? But as Thompson talks about, that's not the impurity we're talking about now when we talk about the impurity of food. That's not the danger impurity, as we call it in the biz. All right. Hope that's clear. You have questions? No questions means you're just overwhelmed by all this, right? Otherwise you'd have 1,000 questions, which I understand. The JSB on this kind of stuff is very helpful, right? The notes in the JSB are very, very helpful, as well as the essay, which I mentioned on the first page of the handout. There's a nice essay by Jonathan Clowens of Boston University on this in the back. If you're interested, it's something you can look at. Trying to sort these things out. Okay. There being no questions, I guess everything being very clear, I guess my powers of explanation are greater than I thought. One volunteer. Yes?
So if you eat like an impure food, so technically you're allowed to, but then you just have to undergo the purification process.
Excellent. Put your finger on a difficult point. Right. We seem to here's a contrast between Leviticus 11 and its parallel in Deuteronomy 14. Right. Where according to Leviticus, as we're about to see right now, a whole bunch of animals are classified as impure, which in context means that you, Israelite, ought not to eat them, because if you do, you will contract impurity. Now, it's not exactly sinful to be an impure, as I've already discussed. However, one assumes normally an Israelite would like to walk around not being impure, but to be in a state of purity. So Leviticus 11 seems to suggest you could eat these things, but if you do, you will become impure, and then you got to watch out to make sure that you don't trespass upon the sacred in a state of impurity. You'll have to wait till nightfall or something for the impurity to lapse. Deuteronomy 14 makes it quite clear, no. When I say these animals are impure, what I mean is don't eat them. So Leviticus 11 is actually quite ambiguous on that point. It's actually very tricky. It's sending out mixed signals on that. But the language of impurity in the animals means something we Israelites should avoid.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay? Yes, sir?
For a place where...
Okay, good. So impurity is, the height of impurity is a corpse, right? The most potent source of impurity is a human corpse in the system of Leviticus and the book of Numbers, right? By most potent, meaning that it can be transferred to the furthest number of links in a chain with the greatest degree of consequences from a corpse. right, as opposed to a dead creeping thing described in Leviticus 11, is the most minimal potential for transfer, right? It's only the person who touches it or comes in direct contact with it. Otherwise, it doesn't transfer beyond that. If you don't have a corpse at all, someone dies in the World Trade Center, and there is no corpse, right? So there's no impurity because there's no corpse, but we have a whole set of other issues to worry about, such as, is the person dead or not? Can his wife remarry, for example? Is there still a state of marriage or not? And so on. That's a whole set of other issues which are beyond our discussion here. Okay, we're interested here in an actual corpse. By the time you get to the rabbis, they worry about how about a piece of a corpse, not a whole corpse. Right? Does that also convey impurity to the same degree? Then, of course, it all depends. But we need to move on. Okay. Thank you. Any other questions? Let's move along. Okay. So, Leviticus 11, in this context, in these chapters 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, that deal with purity, and here I'm not referring to the moral purity of Leviticus 18, but to this physical state purity, we might say. Either you are or you aren't. Either these things happened to you or they didn't. Either your body is experiencing these things or it's not. And if it's so, then impurity follows, and if not, no impurity follows. And if you are impure, it's not a bad thing as long as you stay away from the sacred. But you want to make sure you become purified before you, for example, bring a sacrifice to the tabernacle. You might want to get yourself purified first. Okay. So in the context of Leviticus 11, what's very clear when references to animals, we discover that the animals of the world are divided up between the pure and the impure. And the impure animals means these are the animals the Israelites are to avoid, or perhaps we might say more pointedly, Israelites may not eat. At least that's how Deuteronomy construes it. So, on the macro level, the logic is clear. By the macro level, I mean I understand that the Israelite narrator, legislator, philosophers, thinkers who are behind this chapter, Leviticus 11, and this whole system of purity, I understand the macro logic. The macro logic is, you might say in a nutshell, God makes distinctions. While it's true, God is universal God, Genesis chapter 1. God created the whole world and all that is therein, Genesis chapter 1. Right? God created all the animals and all the people on the face of the planet, Genesis chapter 1. Nonetheless, here's the key point that the priestly school of writers and thinkers who are behind these chapters would argue, God makes distinctions. What distinctions does God make? God makes distinctions between the nations of the world and the people of Israel. People of Israel stand in a special status vis-a-vis God. God created everybody. We're all alike children of the Lord. But the nations of the world clearly are further removed from the divine presence than the people of Israel. And within the people of Israel, there's a further distinction of priests. Us Cohens, right, who get to go inside into the temple, into the sacred precincts, where lay Israelites are not. Similarly, there are all the countries of the world. God created the whole civilization, well, the whole planet, as we would call it. Right, within that, though, the country of Israel, the district of Israel, clearly is the Holy Land. There aren't that many passages in the Bible that actually have this notion, as much as you would have thought, but enough, anyway, that at least the priests imagine that the land of Israel is a sacred land. All the lands that come from God, the sacred land is the land of Israel, and within the sacred land of Israel, what's the most sacred spot? Jerusalem, where the temple is. Not the tabernacle, which wanders around the Exodus, it wanders around the desert in a mysterious way. It's the temple, which is located in that one central sacred spot. Similarly, animals. God created all the living creatures on the face of the planet. They all come from God. Again, Genesis chapter 1. But within those, we have a subset of those are animals that may be eaten. And the other animals, the pure animals. And other animals are impure. And within the animals that may be eaten, there's a further subset of animals that may be brought to the altar. Because animals that can be used for sacrifices, described at great length in Leviticus chapter 1 through chapter 8, where it is, 9, described in great length, right? Only a subset of the animals that we can eat are animals that we bring to the altar. So in other words, as I say again, the nutshell is God makes distinctions. On the macro level then, we might say, and here I have this lovely line, the mystery of kosher animals mirrors the mystery of the election of Israel. Or to put it differently again, God makes distinctions in creation. All alike are the work of God, but not all alike. That's the message, at least, this is how I, Shaya Cohen, and many other scholars try to understand what's going on in these chapters. How to understand how these priestly writers look at the world. They look at the world primarily because of the fact that they are priests. We priests are a subset of the people of Israel, who in turn are a subset of humanity. We priests are special. People of Israel are a little less special, but they're also special. And there's everybody out there. Similarly, we have the animals for the altar, animals that we may eat, and then just the animals out there. The $1 million problem is the micro level. So the macro level, I understand the logic, I understand the thinking, I understand why priestly authors would see the world in these terms, as reflecting in large part their own sense of who they are. The micro level, i.e. to explain why do they come up with this set of distinctions between animals and not some other set of distinctions between animals, that is once again a subject for Anthro 101. To try to understand this very mysterious set of criteria that they came up with. Land animals have split hooves and chew their cud. Water animals have fins and scales. Winged creeping things are prohibited except unless they have jointed legs above their feet. Right? Where do these things come from? And why on earth do they pick just these criteria? Why did they pick some other criteria? And what does it mean that we may only eat fish that have fins and scales? We may not eat fish that do not have fins and scales. Or, in a nutshell, flounder, yes, lobster, no. Or in the case of quadrupeds, right, steak, yes, ham and bacon, pork, no. Why? What does that mean? On this point, there is numerous disagreements, and over 100 years of modern scholars, anthropologists, and psychologists of religion, trying to understand what these mysterious qualities represent, or what they're trying to say. This is described for you in your notes in the JSB. I'm not going to go over the notes in the JSB. Give you a nice survey of various attempts to explain these things on the micro level. I would simply argue, just to make the big points, medical explanations are very popular among medievals and moderns, but these seem unlikely. Right? Is the legislator in the Torah trying to save Israelites from trichinosis? Well, yeah, I suppose, but that's not what's going on here, surely. It's we moderns understand medicine as a driving source of almost everything. Right? Everything is medicalized in our culture. Right? This is not true in antiquity. Just as in the case of circumcision. Right? I do not believe that the driving need for a circumcision was to avoid phimosis or some other disease of the foreskin. That seems very unlikely as the cause. As an unintended beneficial side effect? Yeah, possibly. Sure. But as the cause, I don't believe it. Similarly, as the cause for these food laws, because the legislator is looking out for public health. That's why we're avoiding animals that might be dangerous to our health. This is an awfully odd way to say that. So you ask me, so what does it mean, Professor? What's this chew the cud stuff, split and hoof stuff, fins, scales, jointed joints above the, what the hell is going on? Well, I say again, the logic is elusive. Look at the JSB, they'll try to give you explanations. Anyway, Greek-speaking Jews, the passage of Barnabas, we've already met the epistle of Barnabas. Barnabas gives you the allegorical explanation, which we'll come back to briefly on Wednesday. Right, namely, there are moral qualities here, but they represent our moral qualities. Right, so the things we are to avoid are people whom we are to avoid, who in turn have negative moral qualities that we should avoid. That's what Moses really means. So chew the cud does not mean chewing the cud at all, it really means something else, which Barnabas tells you. And the forbidden animals, each one represents a kind of negative moral quality that we are to avoid. That's an allegorical reading. Once again, I would say it's a very clever reading, it's very nice, it's a nice way to extract moral truths from an otherwise inscrutable text. That I understand. But at the end of the day, I can't believe that's what the passage quote really means. Well, Professor, that's because you're a Jew. That's why you say that. Well, yeah, maybe. Guilty. I still don't think that's what Moses meant. That doesn't make terribly much sense to me, that moral. Anyway, read the passage of Barnabas. We'll come back to it briefly on Wednesday. And you see whether you think Barnabas is a beautiful passage. It's clever. It's actually, it has some amazing things in there about his notions of animals. You should read the passage. It's a PG-13 text, if there ever was one. Maybe an R text. But anyway, I don't believe that's the passage quote really means. You look at it and see. Anyway, so the bottom line, we have a series then in Leviticus 11, the references to impure animals, right, which are manifest. Here the impurity is manifest, and we Israelites are not to eat them. I'll come back on Wednesday and talk about the social implications of this social system and how later rabbinic thinkers approach this problem about meaning, try to understand why God is making these distinctions in the natural order. The key insight is that the distinctions in the natural order of animals in the animal kingdom reflects, mirrors the natural distinction in the human kingdom. Priests, Israelites, humanity. That I think I understand, and that I think that to my mind at least makes sense. But, as a number of ancient writers like to say, on this point let each reader decide as he sees fit. Try to make sense out of these mysterious laws. Okay, that's enough about Leviticus 11. I got 6 minutes to do some other things. So read Leviticus 11 if you haven't already done so. Read it very carefully with the notes in the JSB and see how the JSB tries to make sense out of this passage, which we all agree is very, very cryptic, right? It's very mysterious. It's not that we don't believe what the Torah says in it to explain these laws. The Torah provides no explanation for these laws. It simply says, don't eat this. You may eat that. And it's we, readers, who of course yearn for some kind of explanation. Okay, questions on this? Again, we'll pursue this further on Wednesday. We're not finished with all this yet. Questions? Okay, 4 more food prohibitions, right? So here I'll get to the end. So Leviticus 11, with its parallel in Deuteronomy 14, is the main passage listing the animals that Israelites are not to eat. But there are other passages in the Torah which show that there are other food prohibitions too, which we need just to mention, to be complete. 1. Genesis 32:32. Israelites do not eat the sciatic nerve in the hind quarter. This I referred to briefly already last week. Right? Remember when I said that there are only 2 commandments in the book of Genesis? I know the rabbis think there are 3, but I'm not going to bother with that. Right. So back to where I am. There are only 2 commandments in the book of Genesis. The first one is the commandment of circumcision, Genesis 17, given to Abraham. And then there's this one, right, in which Genesis 32 records that, and it's not mentioned anywhere else, records that the Israelites do not eat the sciatic nerve, the Gid HaNasheh, because of some incident in the life of Jacob, the forefather Jacob. So this prohibition also then is pre-Sinaitic. Remember that? Pre-Sinaitic?
Yes.
Which means before Sinai, before the Ten Commandments. It's still in the book of Genesis. Right? But this very mysterious one, here it is. It's not mentioned anywhere else. And here it is. Take it or leave it. So, okay, that's all I'm going to do with it. Not much I can do. The next one is interesting. 2. Deuteronomy 14:21. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. This was discussed in your reading of a couple of weeks ago. So I can be brief here. Right? This is repeated 3 times. Twice in Exodus and once in the book of Deuteronomy. You shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Nobody knows to this day exactly what this text is referring to, except to say that it means you should not boil a kid in its mother's milk. Yeah, I know. But why you would come up with such an exotic recipe, what this really means is a question that ancient, medieval, and modern scholars alike have all grappled with, and no one has really come up with an entirely satisfactory explanation. Although everybody sort of intuits there must have been some profane ritual out there that the Israelites were found abhorrent, and they're prohibiting here with this language. But to find evidence for that ritual, though, is not easy. Anyway, back to where I am. So we have this threefold repetition of you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk. The rabbis took the threefold repetition to be a sign that Scripture wants us to read this prohibition expansively, to blow it open. So when it says boil, it's not just to boil, just any kind of cooking. It's also eating. It also means deriving benefit from. And when it says a kid, it doesn't just mean a kid, it means any quadruped. And when it says mother's milk, it doesn't just mean it's mother's milk, it means any milk.
Any dairy.
Any dairy. Yes, any milk or milk-derived products. As a result, by the time the rabbis finish, you shall not boil a kid in its mother's milk, this turns out to be a prohibition of cheeseburgers. It's a prohibition against putting butter sauce on your steak, because you're mixing meat with dairy. Now, how you get, you might logically ask, how you get from you shall not boil a kid to its mother's milk to a prohibition of butter sauce on your meat? Well, I agree with you. There's a long journey here. There's a long stretch. That's described in your reading by Stern a couple weeks ago. So it's a very good example of expansive exegesis. The rabbis are blowing open the verse, right? Taking each of these words to mean not just itself, but to be a whole category of things well beyond what it actually says in the text. So why are they doing this? What's their excuse to blow open the text? The only excuse I can think of is it's repeated 3 times. So they understood if Scripture says it 3 times, surely it's not there because you forgot. It's not there because God forgot. Surely it's there because it's a clue. We're meant to read this verse, blow it open, read it expansively. Anyway, bottom line, it shows everybody that the rabbis are not the champions of literal reading of Scripture. Yes, we all agree? The prohibition of a cheeseburger seems to be distant from boiling a kid in its mother's milk. But there you go. Okay, that's all review. 1 minute left. Prohibition of eating blood. I'll come back to that on Wednesday. That's too important to skip over. Prohibition of eating carrion. The key point there is if an animal dies in the field, can you eat it? Right? Bessie the cow dies of a massive heart attack. The answer is no. You may not eat it. You can derive benefit from it. You can use the stuff, use the corpse. You can sell it, right? But you can't eat it. You can't eat it. Key point. Because you can't eat it because food that we eat is a product of culture, not nature. Sorry, we're dealing with animals. We only have animals that we eat are a product of culture, i.e. the meat must be slaughtered by human artifice. If the animal just dies, we may not eat it, in turn is a source of impurity. All right, I'll pick up on those latter points to the beginning on Wednesday. On Wednesday we'll talk about some rabbinic things and Christian things. Okay, everybody, see you Wednesday.